We're going to turn off our cameras for just a second. Get ready for our next panel. I'll invite them on in just a minute or two, and we'll get started with our next session. Thank you all. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today. We're going to be welcoming on our next panel now. Apologies to those of you who we didn't get to ask all the questions at the last session. We are able to see all those on Zoom, and we can save those and share those with our panelists, so that if there's an opportunity for them to answer any of those afterwards, we'll try to get some of those questions over to them. I am very excited about this next panel for several reasons. As many of you know, WIDA launched a Trade in the Environment series in 2020, and we plan to continue that discussion this year. Addressing climate change is a top policy goal for the Biden administration, and we plan to address various aspects of this issue from a trade perspective, both this year and in the years to come. Before I introduce this panel, however, I want to continue to call out some of those who are with us at the conference today. Welcome today to Jennifer Safavian from Autos Drive America, and one of our sponsors for the conference. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks as well to Alex Perkins with Stellantis and James Breeden with Uno Trade, two of our other sponsors. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'd also like to welcome Flory Lizer with the Corporate Council on Africa, and former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills at the Hills and Company. Thank you so much, and welcome Alex, Jennifer, James, Flory, and Carla, and welcome to our panelists who are coming to us from around the world today. Ambassador Vangelis Vitalis, who is coming to us today from Auckland, New Zealand, where it is 8 a.m. Tuesday morning, I believe. Madelaine Tuininga, who's coming to us from, I think, from Brussels, where it's 6 p.m. in the evening, if I'm not mistaken. Or no, maybe even 8 p.m. in the evening, excuse me. Him Das, who is coming to us from Washington, and my good friend, Ambassador Robert Holleyman, who is also coming to us from Washington. We're delighted to have the opportunity to bring all of you together at our 2021 International Trade Conference, while we're also limiting our own carbon footprint for this panel. As I mentioned, this issue is of vital importance to all of us wherever we are in the world, and I'm very excited to hear your thoughts. Robert?
Great. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for everyone who's connected with us today for this discussion. I'm honored to lead the discussion because I think that the issues around trade, climate, environmental sustainability have never been more important than they are now. And indeed, I'll say I think there's an opportunity, indeed a necessity, that as nations we work together to try to use every lever that we have available to us to make progress in reducing the challenges of climate change, addressing those challenges, and ensuring that in all of our policies, including our trade policies, we're promoting a cleaner, healthier environment. Delighted to be part of this discussion. I think here in the US, we certainly have a lot of discussions about climate that have really accelerated in the past several weeks. And certainly as the US has gone back into the Paris Agreement, as we see a variety of executive orders from the new president of the United States related to climate, it is also appropriate that we look at where the US stands globally, where our neighbors in the European Union and in New Zealand stand on these issues, the opportunity for the US to assert or reassert leadership in this area, and finally, the realistic prospects for how we can accommodate the kind of changes that are needed in the trade landscape, given the multiplicity of factors, both for developing, developed, and least developed economies. So with that discussion, I'm delighted to have our three participants today. Their full bios are in the materials for the conference. So I'll just briefly mention their bios up front, and after I do all three and a couple of additional comments, we'll go right into our questions for the panel. Madelaine Tuininga is the DG Trade Head of Unit for Sustainable Development and the European Green Deal at the European Commission. And there she works on a broad range of topics, including trade aspects of labor, environment, development, and human rights. Ambassador Vangelis Vitalis is the New Zealand Deputy Secretary of Trade and Economic, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He is also the Senior Officials Meeting Chair, the SOM Chair, for APEC 2021, which APEC is pleased to have New Zealand as its host for the APEC discussions this year. And as someone who's been deeply involved in APEC for a long time, I'm delighted they're chairing and look forward to some of his thoughts about how APEC may also fit into New Zealand's plans. And then finally, Him Doss is the Senior Managing Director for K2 Integrity. He's also the former Senior Director for International Trade and Investment at the National Security Council and the Obama administration. And in that role, he was responsible for coordinating White House policy on trade negotiations, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and a variety of other trade enforcement matters. So with that as a background, let me say I think there is plenty of fodder for discussion here today. And so let me jump in. What I'd like to do is pose sequentially a question to each of you, starting with Madelaine. Hear Madelaine's initial response and thoughts about that question, and then I'll move on to Vangelis and to him. And then hopefully we can have a very interactive discussion with more questions to come, including questions from our audience. So let me start out with a question to Madelaine. Again, thank you for connecting with us in your evening in Europe. Certainly the European Union is not only a large market, but it's shown itself to be a major driver of trade policy. Now, climate and environment are at the top of a list of growing global concerns, and certainly they are very much front and center within the EU. So I'd welcome your opening thoughts on how you see these issues playing out globally, both within the EU and some perspectives on that intersection with trade. Now, that's a lot to ask in a 5-minute opening response to that question, but I think it's a great way to flesh out some of these ideas and to get our discussions going on a smooth foot today. So with that, Madelaine, let me turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having invited me for this evening session for me. And good morning, elsewhere, and good afternoon. I think for half of you. I think you actually used the very right word, opportunities, and that sounds weird in the times of crisis and COVID. But if I see how we've been coming out of the last 1.5 years, it is a constant effort to find opportunities in these times of changes. Now, climate and environment are clearly on the top of the list of growing global concerns. And it is not an individual country or region issue, but a global issue clearly requiring a global response. So this means full speed in putting efforts together at global level and consistent with that full speed at domestic level. And that's very much the EU Green Deal, which is our roadmap for stepping up our ambition internally and externally. Climate, biodiversity, circular economy, and so on, they are all interconnected, requiring an ambitious plan across the board, I would say. The implementation of this plan, this Green Deal within the EU is in full swing. So for those who are a bit more familiar with it internally, we have a very long legislative list on the agenda. I think the most well-known one is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, intended to come out in June this year, but we are also working on legislation for deforestation, for due diligence, green claims, to name a few. Externally and multilaterally, we're working hard with partners for an ambitious COP outcome in Glasgow, a COP for the Convention on Biodiversity, to name a few, and we are investing bilaterally in green alliances and partnerships. So what's the link to trade? Green ambitions require transformation of the economy, without any doubt. Now even more important as part of the economic recovery. All of this has a fundamental interaction with trade and investment. Technologies, we heard it in the previous session, and climate-friendly trade and investment are needed. The EU is working on a new trade policy communication to come out somewhere in this month, which will bring clearly more green also to the core of trade policy. This transformation to climate neutral economic growth will require further mainstreaming also of climate across policies, including trade. Now, what were we doing in trade? Not only we, also other countries are working on, in one or another way, on carbon border adjustment mechanisms to avoid the carbon leakage. In full compliance, of course, with the WTO. So that's clearly where there is a role for trade. This is combined, in our view, with a very active part for trade that trade will have to play in supporting the EU's ecological transition. Multilateral. And I'm glad to be here also with New Zealand because we're working together, both staunch supporters of the negotiations to liberalize trade in goods, in the environmental goods agreement. We all know that came to a pause in 2016. We remain committed to these goals. The time, as you said, is now really ripe to retake our ambitions and bring it to the next level, building on the EGA lessons. We feel that there is a momentum and we want something with, I would say, 4 points across the different functions of the WTO. Not only goods, but all the functions of the WTO. With a wider membership, you already alluded to it. We're not only a rich man's club, developed and developing countries with a wider membership than we had under EGA. The third would be a clear narrative of the driving factors for each of these areas, whether it is climate, above all, I would say, but also circular economy and other environmental topics. This is maybe where we fail to convey the message that across services, goods, domestic measures, we're able to integrate this in trade policy. And I would say a final point, and this is something we very much have taken up, is involving stakeholders, business, academics, all those who know a lot about the topic. At this moment, we're working very closely with like-minded countries in the WTO. What we hope is that this leads to a broad multilateral initiative encompassing more elements than EGA, as I said, goods, services, transparency of domestic measures, including border measures, fossil fuels, to name a few, and development. As said, with a better integration of climate mitigation, circular economy, and the like across these building blocks. Let's not forget that we're also negotiating a fisheries subsidies agreement. Bilaterally, we are also very active in our FTAs, whether it is in dedicated chapters through trade and sustainable development chapters, mainstreaming climate and green throughout free trade agreements, in the relevant goods and services part, public procurement, and so on. And probably also very important, using FTAs as a platform for reinforcing policy exchanges, whether it is on domestic measures like border adjustment measures or others. We've also lifted up Paris in our agreement to start with the UK. Paris has become an essential element clause, as we call it, of our trade agreements. Unilaterally, we're also working on it. Maybe to end, playing out globally. How do we play this out globally? I think we heard it also earlier in the previous session I was listening in. Working together is crucial. We are dealing with global challenges requiring a global response. Can we team up, encouraged by the climate challenges, with usual and less usual alliances? For climate, are we really ready to move to net zero commitments with a clear pathway expressed in the NDCs? How does that translate to the trade policy agenda? We're talking about the big emitters: China, Japan, Canada, Korea, Brazil, EU, and of course the US. The US indeed has a key role to play. How will the recent announcements that you summed up, including the recommitment for the Paris Agreement, how will that translate to the external agenda, in particular the trade agenda? We hope we can work as closely together as we did under the EGA. We teamed up very closely with the US, and we hope to do likewise in a renewed WTO green agenda, extending beyond goods and also bilaterally. Just maybe to briefly mention that we've put forward in December a proposal for a new forward-looking transatlantic agenda, which includes a comprehensive transatlantic green trade agenda. I'll leave it here. I think I made it to my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. A lot of activity, a great way to open up our discussion. I'll tell you, I particularly smiled when I heard references to environmental goods agreement, and think back to 10 years ago also to the APEC 2011 Honolulu Declaration that really set off to reduce tariffs on a list of 54 environmental goods. Certainly progress made by APEC members in committing to that, but I think progress that really has stymied in part, and that also sets the stage for going forward. Also hearing the circular economy discussion leads me to thinking about what APEC has done around issues like marine debris, as well as issues that you talked about in the EU that are being addressed in APEC around illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So I think there's a great opportunity on all parts of the globe to unite these agendas and develop a positive one going forward. So with that, let me ask a question to Vangelis. New Zealand has a global leadership role in regarding climate. You have been quite clear on that. You also have this important role in your negotiations on an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. We have your host for APEC this year, and I hope I've been a good plug for New Zealand and your APEC host year, because it's great to see New Zealand hosting that this year. So share some of your thoughts on how New Zealand sees its leadership role on these, both in terms of negotiations, in terms of the forums, and how, as you see a changing landscape globally, how do you see that as impacting New Zealand's opportunities and needs, and then launching that into the global square? Vangelis?
Thank you very much, and my thanks for the very warm plug for APEC. That was appreciated. And I do want to touch on APEC here. I want to speak in three parts. One, kind of contextualize the New Zealand approach. Second, to briefly kind of reference the classical approach that people have taken to the trade and environment nexus, but then to talk really in the substance of my remaining 2 or 3 minutes, really about the innovation. So the innovative approach that we want to bring, both through the agreement you just mentioned, the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, but also in terms of what we're planning for APEC. So let me start with how we're trying to think about this here in New Zealand. First of all, it's the classical trade and environment mutual supportiveness point, that these need to be mutually reinforcing objectives. Our second driver for this is very much the need to demonstrate that trade can help provide solutions here. Trade is not the silver bullet that's going to solve climate change or our sustainability challenges, but trade can certainly assist. And there are some traditional ways that we think about it, and we've heard about that earlier today, including in terms of environmental goods and service, liberalization, lower the price, improve the uptake, improve innovation, and so on. And that is an important element to all of this. The third framing reference point we have in New Zealand is to sustain the social license for trade policy, which has come under tremendous pressure, I think, internationally. By being able to demonstrate how trade can contribute to solutions, I think we are able to better sustain sort of public support for the trade agreements that I think we regard as so critical. That brings me to the second part of just basically to touch point the classical approach that we've taken over the last 20 years on trade, and in common with everyone else. Environmental goods and services, of course, the Doha Agenda, the WTO-MEA relationship, and of course the fish subsidies, where New Zealand has been at the forefront of efforts to define that and resolve that in the World Trade Organization. And of course, we hope that will finally be achieved this year, which I might say is actually, we've already missed the Sustainable Development Goal deadline. Look, that's one cluster of the classical approach. The other classical approach is to do this through your free trade agreements. There you have chapters. The EU, of course, does trade and sustainable development chapters. The United States does chapters on trade and labor, trade and environment, as do we. And in CPTPP, I think you saw some important elements there. There was an agreement amongst the 11 of us on fish subsidies, on IUU fishing subsidies, and of course on overfishing and overcapacity. I think the important thing that CPTPP did also was the legal enforceability of the commitments. I think that is a very significant thing. The use of fines and sanctions does give this particular teeth. I think the other interesting element for people to think about in free trade agreements is, of course, green procurement and how you might use the government procurement chapter of a free trade agreement to advance that. So you have the WTO, you have your free trade agreements, and then you have the standalone agreements, of which we've already touched on, the environmental goods agreement, which unfortunately did fall over, but nevertheless is an important kind of classical response. But now I want to talk about the innovations. And the first innovation I want to talk about is the agreement that our Prime Minister launched about 18 months ago now, the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. That is in 3 parts. Classical piece, environmental goods and services, eliminate those, deal with the non-tariff measures, and put in place more liberal access for environmental services. The second element was eco-labeling, again, a pretty classical response in the trade environment to develop some principles that you would use that would be guidelines for people developing eco-labels. But the really significant and interesting innovation that this agreement does is to say, we're going to use this trade agreement to tackle fossil fuel subsidies. So fossil fuel subsidies are continually rising. They exceed now $450 billion a year. And they are, if we could eliminate those, they would be a very significant contributor to mitigating the climate challenge we all confront. So the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability essentially is a group of small like-minded countries, Switzerland, Norway, Costa Rica, Fiji, New Zealand, Iceland, that say, we're not going to wait anymore. We think that trade can drive change in fossil fuel subsidies and can reach reform. And we, of course, will negotiate this agreement. And then we're going to invite other like-minded economies to join us using trade rules to discipline fossil fuel subsidies. So I think a very important new innovation, and to my mind, a very important groundbreaking agreement as we head into the COP at the end of the year. Bearing in we could eliminate all fossil fuel subsidies internationally, that would be the equivalent of 12% of the mitigation that we would need to reach the Paris target. And by the way, that's the equivalent of about nearly 80 countries stopping all emissions tomorrow. So a very significant contribution. Look, the second big innovation that we are looking to advance is in APEC. We do have ambitions in APEC. We've been very open about that as chair. And there are essentially sort of 4 main areas. The first is in the fish subsidy space. What could we do here to support the WTO negotiations? How is it that we can advance together? One area we're trying to think about, of course, is IUU fishing. Can we agree, for example, the pretty obvious thing, which would be to put a standstill and to eliminate amongst the 21 of us, at least the subsidies on IUU fishing. The second area is the one you mentioned at the start, which is there are 54. APEC is the only international organization that has a list of environmental goods. Can we, nearly 10 years later, update that list? It was 54. We know from the Environmental Goods Agreement negotiations it can be a much longer list. Can we, amongst the 21 of us, update that list? And could we also add services? So that would be a very big contribution, but again, a classical one from APEC. The third area is renewable energy targets. So hand in hand with the need to reduce subsidies and to tackle the tariffs and non-tariff barriers on goods and services, can we agree within APEC how we're going to deal with the renewable energy revolution that's coming? How should that look? New Zealand as chair has to prepare the action plan that converts the Putrajaya vision, the APEC Putrajaya vision. It's a 20-year program, and we're expecting in the document to put in place specific targets that APEC economies would need to agree and then implement. But perhaps most significantly, the big innovation we would like from APEC is that APEC economies would agree a standstill on fossil fuel subsidies. That would be a very, very substantial contribution. And I note with great interest that the President Biden's executive order has said that by 2022, no federal funds would be used in the United States to support fossil fuels. So it seems to us that this standstill idea on fossil fuel subsidies in APEC might be just the thing to galvanize some action just ahead of the COP, but also ahead of the WTO ministerial. And that brings me to my final observation, which is these are challenging times we are in, and we do have an opportunity, and I do strongly agree with the Commission's point about opportunity and the need to seize this opportunity. We do have a big challenge ahead of us, but we do have agency. The situation is urgent, but we do have agency. But if I may say so, we do need an active United States engaging, supporting, and working with us and all of the other economies, not just in APEC, but internationally, to drive this agenda forward to actually get meaningful change.
Thank you very much. Great food for thought and a perfect way to lead into our next speaker, Him Das. So Him, as you have certainly heard from both Madelaine and Vangelis, their countries, their regions have a lot of goals and they are moving forward. But I also hear from both of them a desire, and indeed I would say a need, for the U.S. to be an active player in this space. So the question for you is, how do you believe the U.S. should be looking at this? And I say that in a way of both thinking about what you know about the Biden administration priorities of climate, but what we also recognize is a closely divided nature of Congress and a very politically charged discussion of trade in the US and what the US should be doing. So what do you think the US is likely to do around trade, sustainability, climate? And to put you on the spot, what do you think the US should do in this space? So let me turn it over to you, Him.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Robert. And I appreciate the comments made both by Madelaine and Vangelis as well, in terms of the overall ambition, the need for a global action on climate-related issues. And I think that the Biden administration already in its first couple of weeks has left a mark on the broader global climate agenda, as well as the US climate agenda as well. The executive orders that the administration issued at the end of January, as Vangelis noted, are pretty significant first steps in terms of ambition and defining an overall approach towards climate action by the United States. The executive orders create a national climate task force. They appoint a national climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, to lead domestic efforts. And they name John Kerry to be a special presidential envoy to lead international engagement. And the administration rejoined the Paris Agreement as well. These are experienced officials. They've engaged domestically and internationally significantly on climate-related issues, and their commitment to climate action is well known, and it is significant. A key point in terms of the executive orders is a cornerstone of the executive orders and the administration's efforts is that any action, both domestically and internationally, will require a whole of economy and whole of government approach, and those are reaffirmed in the executive order in a number of circumstances. And this dovetails well with the Paris Agreement, which asks countries to define economy-wide absolute emissions targets as well. Interestingly enough, one of the key issues that I think that we are looking at the Biden administration to see is exactly what the administration's nationally determined contribution towards the Paris Agreement will look like. That will be an important indicator of the level of climate ambition, as well as potentially how the administration may be approaching steps that it might take to achieve that ambition as well domestically. The executive order defines a number of potential actions that many countries are taking. Infrastructure spending that incorporates either climate resilient goals or low carbon emissions trajectories, infrastructure spending towards the climate to design an infrastructure for a climate oriented economy, spending including tax credits and tax expenditures on clean technologies and other efforts, green government procurement policies as well, federal programs that incorporate a social cost of carbon, as well as Vangelis noted, actions and evaluations to address fossil fuel subsidies, both domestically, but also with respect to international financing for fossil fuel infrastructure as well, which is a significant statement. In terms of achieving these broader goals, as you mentioned, Robert, I think the divided Congress is going to present challenges to the climate agenda to the extent legislation is required. On climate, Senator Manchin, the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, has already said that there are not enough votes to support carbon pricing legislation. It's likely that there will be congressional concerns around reducing or eliminating fossil fuel subsidies as well. But at the same time, Congress in the most recent recovery bill passed a pretty significant set of climate efforts, including a phase down of HFCs, extensions of tax credits with respect to green technologies, and funding for green new technologies. So the fact that there's a divided Congress does not necessarily mean that climate forward legislation is simply off the table. I think that it will require the right set of circumstances, a positive agenda, and appropriate engagement by the Biden administration and the executive branch with Congress, as well as all the range of stakeholders in the United States as well. With respect to trade more generally, I think the intersection of climate and trade will be a very important dimension of the administration's agenda. And there are probably a number of things that the administration can do and is likely already considering in terms of its calculation on both its own domestic climate policies in terms of international engagement and the trading agenda as well. I mean, it's hard to say at this point, given that the confirmation processes are still underway and the personnel in the administration are still being filled and its positions are still being taken shape. But there are a number of different positive things that the administration can do in terms of climate-related actions that are mutually supportive. I think at the same time, and against the backdrop of a bigger policy debate around the benefits of trade, I think the administration will also have a mindful eye in terms of actions that it may need to take to ensure a level playing field and to foster a level playing field for American businesses and workers, both in terms of engagement with its trading partners to create that level playing field, but also, potentially in consideration of unilateral actions. And that's something that will evolve and develop over time. The administration has already sort of made a clear statement that they are interested in a multilateral approach and multilateral engagement, both with respect to trade and climate. But as discussions and negotiations go forward, I think that is something that will evolve over time. In terms of climate actions and trade efforts that are mutually supportive, I think there are a number of things, and basically, I will just echo what both Madelaine and Vangelis noted. I think that there is an opportunity to negotiate plurilateral agreements and efforts in APEC around environmental goods as well as services. That is an important development and a forward development that the administration can quickly engage on and make progress on as well. There are pursuing an environmental goods agreement more generally and trying to bring closure to that negotiation, or reinvigorate and then bring closure to that negotiation and potentially include services as well, is probably a very important dimension. And additionally, another option is to include climate considerations in bilateral and regional free trade agreements. This can include a number of trade-related dimensions, and there are a number of different ways to do it. The USMCA and the CPTPP included provisions with respect to addressing the protection of the ozone layer, addressing air pollution, and it seems like there is an opportunity to include climate considerations in discussions around free trade agreements. What the shape of those considerations might be is really quite open. There are a number of different approaches to more expressly include climate considerations, include more express cooperation around trade-related implications of climate action, potentially conversations around border carbon adjustments as well, and potentially also including some element of the Paris Agreement in the list of MEAs, although there are a number of different policy considerations with respect to that. There's also, a couple of different other approaches that the administration can take with respect to negotiating and working with partners on a non-binding cooperative mechanism approach to start conversations around climate action. And that can include a number of different features in terms of what the trade-related impacts of climate action might look like. The last piece in terms of conversations around mutually supportive actions is that in the Obama administration, an initiative was taken to address overcapacity with respect to the steel and aluminum sectors. And that is another area which this administration might be able to sort of pursue in a reinvigorated basis, because addressing overcapacity in certain sectors, for example, steel, aluminum, cement, and other sectors as well, can have both trade-related impacts as well as climate-related impacts in terms of providing a more level playing field for steel and aluminum production around the world, first of all, and second of all, address some of the sort of climate impacts as well. I think last point I want to make is that climate action and environmental action more generally can have broader implications for trade and competitiveness and climate ambition. And I think this is where we get into a few sort of considerations from a Biden administration approach from a defensive perspective as well. As countries start implementing their NDCs, there is potential for trade friction in the way countries implement their NDCs and implement various tools to spur climate action domestically, through subsidies, through incentives, potentially local content requirements, government procurement, import bans, and the like. I think many of these issues devolve into longstanding debates about trade rules, such as the permissibility of local content requirements, whether subsidies are actionable or prohibited, and how countries should be dealing with them, and rules around government procurement. And I think the Biden administration will need to consider how to address some of these issues, because there will be a domestic demand for these issues. potentially through a trade agenda that includes WTO reform in some respects, addresses the dispute settlement mechanism challenges that are ongoing as well. And then also to engage bilaterally and multilaterally with trading partners with respect to some of the efforts that are being taken to address some of the trade friction elements. So I think I'll pause there and then follow up with any questions as the conversation goes forward.
Great, thank you, Him. A lot of food for thought among all three of those panelists. And let me, before I start driving into any specific questions, to see if, now that the three of you have spoken, if any of you have any thoughts about what you've heard from your colleagues, what that prompts you to think in terms of, let's look at it as sort of the opportunities for your countries or for your region. So let me open that up. Madelaine, do you want to share some thoughts on takeaways?
Wow. Well, I think the underlying messages from all are pretty much the same, actually. We really try to exploit all the tools we have. I think the messages are that we've done a lot, and probably what we're trying now is to wind it together in a more strategic view of how you do it. Just three things come to my mind, very practical points. I think we need to start. What we need to avoid, I went partly through EGA.
Yeah.
And you can spend years and years discussing what the list of product is that meet a definition of a certain environmental objective. We need to be careful for that. If we need to show to the system, to the world, that trade can deliver, meaning that we need to find a more comprehensive approach for the next ministerial, but something that delivers and buys in more. So that may be a realism of ambition. On top of it, we are all working online. We probably won't have a lot of physical meetings, and we're trying to reach out. We're now with 50 countries, in working with New Zealand and others in a group of friends like-minded in Geneva. So I think this we need to start and get things going. Is really, it's not that we have endless time. December comes quickly. The other is, you were spot on in saying, as we all, I mean, look around the world between 2016 and now, the countries that have green policies, green deals, green announcements, it's increasing. It's an enormous. So really, from a trade perspective, we have to make a step forward to also creatively think, how can we integrate these policy areas, these concepts actually of your economic organization within a trade concept, without immediately thinking, oh, this doesn't meet the requirements of the WTO TBT agreement, and I don't want to underdo it. So we need to find a balance between the rules-based system and showing that the trade rules can absorb this. We have trade rules can absorb it. So that would be, and then maybe a final one in between, and this is something that's very much something we plead in the WTO, and actually most of when we started working, retaking the word, what is it, a year ago or so, let's not do, there's a competition of initiatives, let's not do a beauty contest. Some may be ready for one measure, others not. We need to find a structure of this ministerial declaration that finds a home for all those good ambitions in environment, and some may go at different paces. And that could be also within goods. There will be, we've been pitching more to look at, should we be more focused in the first step to make it realistic, with a smaller set of products to be liberalized, with a larger number of countries as a first step, to then build from there? Or are we ready in December to say, yeah, we have EGA plus, plus, plus? I think that's a risk, because everybody retakes the EGA list and then looks, what do I want in and out? And before you know, you're back at that. And then maybe a final consideration is this, I mean, there will always be, when you talk trade, there will always be a bit of a competition behind it, level playing field. And that brings you quickly to, I mean, we are talking about green tech and new innovative technologies. There is a competition between countries. In the previous session, most of the discussion centered around China. There is an issue around there, and the question is, this is why I said also my introduction, are we able, now that we have similar high-level climate ambitions, are we able to find solutions for that?
Thank you. I'll just note on the EGA list, I think one of our goals should also be to make it clear that we are negotiating an EGA to advance our environmental and climate goals. And I think too often people in the public hear it as it's a trade negotiation around reducing tariffs, and only secondarily or maybe tertiary, it has some impact on climate and environment. And so it gets lost in sort of some of the skepticism about negotiations. And I think there's an important part of portraying how this can be a critical part of having a better environment and meeting climate goals. Vangelis, let me turn to you, see if you have any thoughts on what your colleagues have been saying.
Thank you. I mean, look, my overriding observation is that there is an urgency to this, and it's not the time for things at the margins is now gone. So I do share the view, actually, of both Madelaine and him, that we really need to get going here, and there needs to be substance to this. And it comes back to my request for kind of a bit of US leadership here, and active engagement. And there are really two things, I think. And I know I would say this because we are the chair of APEC, but APEC is a very good vehicle through which the US can start building some momentum. First of all, you send important signals to all of us in the region about engagement, and that you are also wanting APEC to help deliver the building blocks that then drive us forward in the multilateral framework. And there we have specific ideas here to advance. As I said, the classical piece is the environmental goods and services. You know, can we identify, can the 21 of us agree, here is an updated list of environmental goods, and here is a list of environmental services that we think make a meaningful contribution to tackling both the climate challenge we all face, but also the other environmental problems that we all face internationally. That then takes you straight into, you know, where are we in the World Trade Organization for the ministerial at the end of the year, and also for the COP. Then there's the fossil fuel subsidy standstill. That would be a very, very significant commitment. If leaders could say, right, as of this year, no increases in fossil fuel subsidies. Look, let me be honest, New Zealand would much prefer, let's cut the subsidies. But we accept that the 21 may not, but with the US push there, and we are confident that other major economies in the region would be supportive of that. You only need to look at the trend line across the APEC region to see that this is actually actively possible. Then I think there's APEC, which provides you that supportive environment to drive that momentum forward. And then look, I would encourage an active look by the United States to the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. We are expecting that that agreement will be ready for new members to join it at the COP. So we are positioning it as a, you know, to go to your point about narrative, as a climate change mitigating agreement. Environmental goods and services, fossil fuel subsidies, using trade rules. What we need, this is what in New Zealand we call an open plurilateral agreement. Anyone who can join, any WTO member can join, as long as you can meet the high standards that the initial group are going to set. So I do see that there is an urgency to this, but there is a substantive agenda out there now in APEC, which is a relatively gentle way to start building momentum for the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. And then from initiatives like the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, and the ministerial declaration that no doubt we will need out of the WTO ministerial. My main message, urgency and engagement.
Thank you. And I certainly know that in other areas, including around digital economy, New Zealand has had a leadership role in creating these sort of modular agreements that I think actually bode well for an approach that allows participants to come in at different stages of development, yet allow countries to take a lead. Him, your thoughts on this, and where is given the urgency, where are the earliest places where the Biden administration could potentially engage on these?
Well, I think there are sort of two levels of engagement by the Biden administration overall. There is one in terms of broader leadership and a commitment to ambition, both by the United States, but by all countries as well. And then there is a discussion to be had on technical achievements, low-hanging fruit, and actually sort of delivering quick wins in terms of actually making positive progress on a climate agenda that's actually implementable. In terms of the broad overall goals, I think that there are opportunities around G20 statements and commitments that reinforce and restate the level of climate ambition and initiative required to address the climate challenges, to define what actions the international community can take more specifically going forward at this point. I think that the United States can also participate significantly in the G7 to help move countries along and to sort of move efforts along. The executive order, interestingly enough, identifies a reinvigoration of something called the Major Economies Forum, which was a Bush administration initiative to bring economies together to achieve climate ambition and then carried forward by the Obama administration. But it can serve as a forum for at least identifying goals with respect to economic issues and economic implications of a climate agenda, trade-related issues, and finance-related issues. And that may be a forum in which to discuss fossil fuel subsidies, given the spotlight that the administration has put on it. I also think that in terms of the more sort of technical or low-hanging fruit gains, of course, all of the panelists have talked about environmental goods and services as a potential area for engagement. But I think that also, a discussion around standards is something that APEC can engage on with respect to carbon, climate-friendly technologies as well. And I also do think that identifying sectoral approaches towards climate ambition is another area that the administration can take a look at and the global community can take a look at to be able to address some of the more challenging issues around competitiveness and around a level playing field. And, there have been initiatives in ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, in the IMO, the International Maritime Organization as well. And there could be sort of a focused approach to try to make very concrete and clear progress in some of these more sort of narrow technical areas and sectoral areas that may sort of avoid broader conversations around broader principles where countries can just get tied up in knots in terms of sort of conceptual ideas as opposed to actually making technical progress.
Robert, is it okay if I jump in with a couple audience questions?
Please do jump in.
Thank you. Thanks. So thank you, panelists. We just have a few more minutes. Have a couple questions. I'm going to kind of blend a couple of them that have come in. One had to do with related to him. You had mentioned about the U.S. Steel and aluminum tariffs, but it's sort of a general question for all the trade specialists on here. What is the nexus and the synergy between subsidies and positive environmental steps? There are probably subsidies that are good subsidies and can be used for positive. For example, on industrial clean technologies, we might want to support those sorts of technologies, but at the same time, we're criticizing subsidies that are industrial subsidies for competitive advantage. Is there some sort of nexus between sort of how we measure the subsidies and things that we don't like in trade with the sorts of subsidies that might be good for improving the environment? Maybe Madelaine, is that something that the EU has looked at in any of their trade negotiations or discussions?
Well, I think any of us can reply here. No, I mean, our guideline is essentially from a trade perspective, are these permissible subsidies or not? And the WTO clearly is not prohibiting all subsidies. So that will be the guideline to look at. It's clear that if you have clean technologies coming up, because often it's accompanied by subsidies.
And Him, any thoughts on the nexus with the subsidies and the existing tariffs that we have in place?
In terms of the broader overall framework, I think that my response would be the same as Madeleine's, is that, to the extent that subsidies are prohibited or actionable, those present concerns from a trade perspective. I think the real issue goes down to, where subsidies are either prohibited or actionable or distort the broader economy and have any competitive effects that countries should be taking action with respect to those types of subsidies. And that can be true both with respect to actions that are perceived to be climate friendly, for example, subsidies for solar panels or energy goods or the like that might have anti-competitive effects. And you've seen that here in the United States with respect to countervailing duties applied to solar panels and other climate friendly items. And so I think that, again, it sort of revolves around the subsidy rules. And, again, a lot of these issues about the mutual supportiveness of the trade and environment all boil down to sort of concerns about fairness of the trade rules and whether or not they're in the right place. And I think that, subsidies can have anti-competitive and anti-economic effects regardless of whether they are directed towards environmentally friendly technologies and goods or activities that are not considered to be environmentally friendly as well.
Thanks. And wanted to follow up. Another question came in about the U.S. in its reworked NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, had some new environmental provisions that were upgrading some of the provisions that were in the original NAFTA. There's been some talk that perhaps finding some way of docking onto aspects of the CPTPP might be, maybe there's some environmental provisions that would be a way for the United States to begin connecting with some of its CPTPP partners. Vangelis, is that something that would be welcomed, and do you think there's an opportunity for that in the coming year if the U.S. is looking to take a more forward-thinking approach on trade and the environment?
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of observations, maybe. One, I thought what was interesting about USMCA is that it essentially picked up a lot of the CPTPP material. So its updating of NAFTA was essentially a transfer across of many of the, in fact, all of the elements of CPTPP. I think the interesting question would be, what is it that the US would bring to the table around climate? Because that was, frankly, one of the things that in the TPP and in the CPTPP, I was involved in the CPTPP, that was one of the things that the United States did want to have in the agreement. Now, that's clearly going to change. I think that's the interesting question will be, how does that change and how does that start to look? If I can make an observation on the subsidies question, there are plenty of ways to support companies without getting into, actionable or prohibited subsidies. I think it is important that taxpayers then see how their money is spent. But I can't help thinking that actually the key thing that we actually need to grapple with is get rid of the subsidies that are there already. And fossil fuels is such an obvious place where the G20's already made a commitment to end those by 2025. That's only 4 years away. So there is an urgent, I come back to the urgency point, but I come back to a leadership question and the importance of sending early signals on engagement. And I'm afraid I come back to APEC.
Well, thank you. Robert, any final words on your behalf on this subject? I know it's a topic that you have focused a lot on, and I am grateful to you to coming to WIDA to help lead this discussion. Any thoughts before we wrap this up?
Sure. Thank you, Ken. And I would thank WIDA for taking on these issues. I think that probably one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the area of trade in the United States over the last decade is the need to increase our focus around trade and the environment, and dare I say, now that it's permissible, trade and climate change. I think we've made good progress. We're not everywhere we need to be on labor. I think and hope we will be doing more on gender. I think we've made, certainly part of our trade agreements, environment has been part of it. But I think the biggest element that the U.S. has not yet had an opportunity to address fully is around trade and climate change. And I think to reinstate support for the nexus between trade and probably the biggest issue facing the global economy, we have to re-enter. I think there are three ways that we can do it. One is I think we look at traditional challenges around trade and identify where there's a climate nexus. Now, whether that is the environmental goods agreement and making it clear that's driven by climate concerns. But I would say to Him's point about excess capacity, when we kicked off the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity and Aluminum, a lot of the discussion was appropriately so about the displacement of jobs of people in the United States and the EU and elsewhere who were being hurt because of the excess capacity. But we also know that a major problem around that excess capacity, particularly in areas like aluminum that we see coming out of China, are the sort of massive environmental degradation that's happening. And I think some of those issues need to be reframed so that we are taking on directly the environmental challenges as well as the job and market distorting challenges, so that those issues don't get lost and they add a sense of urgency to this. And finally, I think the lesson for the US is that we also need to address sectoral opportunities. The Biden administration has made it clear that they do not intend to undertake major new trade negotiations until appropriate investments have been made at home that will strengthen our economy. I think that is absolutely important. I think that's also important for the US competitiveness vis-a-vis China in the medium and long term. At the same time, that shouldn't mean, and I don't think the Biden administration believes that that means that the US doesn't engage on trade. And in fact, I would encourage the Biden administration to look at how they engage on these environmental issues and climate issues, whether that is joining with our friends from New Zealand and expanding those negotiations, whether that is taking a chapter out of what we've done in digital trade agreements to negotiate agreements that address climate, including how digital technologies will help advance climate goals. But I think they need to get back in the game. They need to use their unilateral tools, and climate and trade should not be held hostage to massive, broad trade agreements that the US hopefully will engage in at some point, but is unlikely to do in the future. And finally, I'll go out with a pitch for the US and APEC, which is I think that the APEC forum should absolutely be one of the best opportunities for the Biden administration to engage, because the beauty of APEC for all of us who are believers in that, and rightly so, is that because it is non-binding, it allows an openness to new ideas and new thinking that gets countries to entertain future commitments in a way in which they would be more reluctant to do in a traditional trade negotiation. So it is sort of the perfect test bed to move forward. I hope and believe the Biden administration will be active there. And again, I want to thank Wita for having these discussions, and Ken for allowing us all to be part of this great discussion with a supergroup panelist. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Madelaine. Thank you, Vangelis, coming to us from Auckland, Madelaine from Brussels. Him and Robert from Washington, thank you so much for joining us. We are very grateful to all of you. We hope to have you back again. We hope to be live in person for our 21 conference. We'll try to maybe have a virtual and a live component at our home at the Ronald Reagan Building in